Hi, I'm Kylie Johnson, a certified Enneagram coach and college professor from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Today we're going to be talking about conflict resolution, the Enneagram, and how those things go hand in hand. This is a really personal subject for me as this is how the Enneagram was first introduced to me, was as a tool for conflict resolution in my personal relationships. About 6 years ago, a friend of mine loaned me a book and she just said, "You have to read it." Gave me no context. I didn't know it was about the Enneagram. And she said, "You have to read it. There's so much in there that you would love." And I started sifting through the pages and seeing the practical application of such an abstract concept in relationships, and especially in my relationship with my father. I grew up and, very close to my dad, but there were always these ways where we just couldn't figure out how to connect to each other. And so I started reading about a type and man, I wonder if I apply these principles that it's telling me about this type that, I assume my dad is, I didn't know at the time, but, it was worth a shot. And I started applying those things that would help, that type feel respected and loved and affirmed. And his and my relationship started changing single-handedly due to the Enneagram and the tools that brought into my life. Today we're going to talk about, general conflict resolution concepts, and we're going to talk about how your specific type deals with conflict and feedback. We're going to talk about subtypes and how those affect things. So we're going to kind of go on a journey together and explore what it is that the Enneagram can do to help us all in conflict resolution. Most people view conflict as an equation that says you versus me equals the conflict. And they're not very successful at resolving it, because what that does is it pits two people against each other. It says, we have to go against in order to solve something. And it ends ultimately in conflict. It sets the tone for defensiveness. It sets the tone, for an us versus them mentality. But people who are successful at conflict resolution see this equation, learn to reframe it to say that you plus me versus the conflict equals a resolution. So this is the first premise of conflict resolution, is framing it that you are on the same team, you're on the same side, you're working together against, a conflict in order to be able to come to a resolution. Most people think that conflict resolution starts the moment the conflict itself starts, but there are actually a lot of things that we can do before a conflict to set a stage to be able to manage that conflict better. This will look a little bit different, between each type, and we'll go over those more individually a little later on. But one of the main things you can do before a conflict is just assume your partner's best intentions. Set the stage, talk to each other, and say that no matter what comes out of your mouth, I'm going to assume that your intentions for this conversation are good and that they're for us to be able to solve this. The other thing you can do is create a shared language or shared phrases, maybe gestures, whatever that is, where you pre-decide what those mean. That way, if the conversation is getting a little bit too intense and one of you needs a break, maybe that's just a timeout gesture. Or, you can have a phrase that you create, maybe, "Hey, slow down," or "Hey, let's connect," whatever that is, to come together during the actual conflict. All this stuff happens beforehand. It's a conversation that sets you up for success in the actual moment of conflict. During a conflict, the number one thing that you can do to create an environment where it can be resolved is manage your tone in the way that you're coming across to your partner. For some people, that tone will shut them down right away, whether or not you intend it. So, if your partner that you're solving conflict with is pretty sensitive to a harsh tone, go out of your way to use a tone that is going to be they're going to be more receptive to. Another thing you can do during a conflict, especially when things get heated, but really just in general, is practice breathing together. This engages our body and it allows us to, re-enter the moment that we're in. Another thing you can do during conflict, and this one is a personal favorite of mine, is find humor breaks where you say, "Hey, it's getting a little too heavy. We're a little too intense right now. Can we stop and look at some memes or watch some stand-up comedy for a second, or just laugh together about our day?" That can be a really, really helpful tool to diffuse tension in conflict in general. Another helpful thing you can do during a conflict is take turns and listen to your partner share their perspective and then repeat it back to them. And you do this as many times as it takes for your partner to say that they feel like you hear them and understand them. Sometimes it might take once or twice. Sometimes you get frustrated because it takes 5 or 10 times, but the key is to do it until your partner feels understood. Once they feel understood, they're going to be able to actually let their guard down, just like you will when they do that for you, and you'll be able to enter back into that space with a clear mind. One of the most important things that you can do in a conflict situation, but really just anytime you're giving feedback or expressing thoughts to your partner, is frame your statements in a way that says, I feel, rather than a way that says, you make me feel. For instance, if your partner is something really simple, they walk in and they barge through the door and you get really scared. You could either say, wow, when you did that, I felt scared. Or you could say, you made me feel scared, you scared me. They have a totally different tone, and one sets the tone for blame, it creates defensiveness. The other one, when we say I feel, it's us taking responsibility for our own lived experience. When we say, I felt sad when you did that, or I felt happy when you did that, it's us taking ownership for the things that are important to us, and it's not putting blame on our partner that we're working out the conflict with. After a conflict, once you've actually gotten through that tense moment, you both are feeling a little bit heard, one of the most helpful parts of conflict resolution actually comes in this point in time. And that is the feedback that you can give your partner, whether that be, hey, here's 2 to 3 things that you did that were really helpful for me during that conflict. Or here's something you did that wasn't helpful for me. Maybe next time, could we try using this tone? Or whatever that is. Integrative9.com has a great feedback model. It's 5 steps. It's stating your intention with feedback. It is describing the observable behavior to your partner, describing the impact of the behavior, pausing for discussion, and then stating your preferred future behavior. And by following these 5 steps, it creates a model that you can follow together without it becoming an emotionally charged, you did this, you did that. Again, using I feel statements as the backbone for how we communicate through all of this. Overall, pre, during, or post-conflict, the number one thing to remember is to assume your partner's best intentions and to let them know that you're assuming that you're affirming that they mean well, that you're in it together, and that you're both working together. Again, you plus me versus the conflict equals a resolution. Now, when we look at the practical way that the Enneagram ties into all these principles of conflict resolution, one of the first things we want to look at are centers. Now, these don't have to do with your actual type. We'll get into that a little bit later. But centers are actually one of the number one spaces where understanding, how each of us view the world, how we take in the events that we're experiencing, how that affects the way we're going to come into conflict. So there are 3 centers. There's thinking, feeling, and action. Action is also your body. So thoughts, mind, feelings, heart, action, and body. And if you think about a pie chart, we are all some combination of these 3. Someone might be really dominant in feeling and really small in action. And what this means is that what we're most dominant in, it's like if we took a pair of glasses and put it on, it's the way we see events that are happening to us. So, if I'm taking everything in through my feelings, I'm going to have to process those feelings before I can then move to my thinking center. And then before, if that were second, and then to my action center if that were last. And every person scores differently on this. And that is why with conflict, sometimes you see someone who scores really high in their action center having a conflict with someone who scores really high in their feeling center. And they're both going at it, and the action person is thinking, why don't you just take a step, act, do something? And the feeling person is, why are you asking me to act? Why aren't you just feeling through what we're experiencing before we move into making a decision on what to do? And so when we look at these centers and we come to know, our own and the person that we're resolving conflict with, what their centers are, we can then see how those 2 things relate. Relating back to the story I told at the beginning, when I found the type that I assumed was my father, a few years later, it was about 2 years ago now, I decided I was going to get certified to become an Enneagram coach. And I called up my dad and I asked him, I said, Dad, do you want to get certified with me? And so we ended up, taking this class together. We flew to Washington, D.C., spent that time doing the certification process together. And it was one of the training days when we were going over centers that my dad actually came to me and he said, I'm so sorry for how much I thought that I was championing you as a kid, but really I was just telling you to ignore your feelings. And he scores way off the charts in that pie chart in action. And I score way off the charts in feeling. And he looked at that and he just said, all those years I was telling you, don't go by your feelings. And what I was able to tell him is that all those years I thought he was saying who you are is not okay. And simply by coming to know each other's centers and the lens through which we see the world, we were able to resolve a lot of the conflicts that we never could in the past, because there was an empathy there for the way that we saw situations and what we needed before we could move forward. Next, we want to look at the conflict styles of the Enneagram. So we have what we call the Hornevian styles. Now these have to do with how we get what we want. These are assertive, compliant, or withdrawn. So everyone scores in some ratio of these three. Assertive meaning we're going to go for what we want. Compliant is we're going to go along to get along and try to just comply until that leads us to what we want. And withdrawn is I'm going to pull away and I'm going to, kind of stay back here a little bit until you give me what I want. So those are kind of the summary of the three Hornevian styles. And again, those are how we get what we want. But then we have what are called the harmonics, and this is what we do when we don't get what we want. And these three are called competency, positive outlook, and reactive. So, we don't get what we want. Competency says, well, I'm competent and I'm going to figure it out, and, reacts in that way. Positive outlook actually goes the other way and it's like, well, it could be worse. We could have had it a lot worse off than we do now. And reactive might get angry or, react in some big way. When it comes to reality distortion, every human being has a certain ratio or percentage that we fake good when things aren't so good, and we fake bad when things aren't so bad, and there's a balance there. Inner child psychology tells us that we will repeat the patterns that were taught to us, and sometimes that's growing up in a household where we were made out to think the world is ending all the time and everything's going wrong, and so we might fake bad. It also might just be a facet of our personality to maybe be a little more pessimistic based on the number that we are or type that we are. On the other hand, we might fake good and we might pretend that things are okay even when they're not. This all comes from our upbringing and, partly nurture and partly just plays off of, who we already are. I remember in my first therapy appointment about 8 years ago, I had taken an aptitude test, and an aptitude test is in essence a graph that tells you every way that you're unhealthy. And if you are a perfectionist, like some of us, it was a little bit hard to look at. And I remember my therapist telling me, he said, hey, these represent the patterns that you were taught, and you're going to outgrow those patterns. You are going to do the work and get through that. But first, you have to recognize those patterns. And, he used an example, and he said, if a daughter grows up and her dad is an alcoholic, her definition of love becomes someone loves me when they give up the alcohol. In order for her to then have someone love her based on that definition of love, who does she have to then choose in order to love her? An alcoholic. In the same way, when we grow up with patterns of, faking good, faking bad, whatever it may be, patterns of codependency or of ultra independence, we think that that pattern is the way to get what we want, when really it's about recognizing that and then growing deeper into who we are, and not the pattern we grew up with, but patterns that are healthy and sustainable to be able to then solve conflict with the people we want to solve conflict with, and just to be whole, healthier selves. Next, we want to look at subtypes. So subtypes are who we are outside of our type. It's the way that each type is expressed a little bit differently. And in subtypes, those are the self-preservation, the one-to-one, also sometimes referred to as the sexual, and the social. Now, in conflict, the self-preservation subtype, the primary concerns are going to be survival, security, well-being, comfort, structure, avoiding danger, things like that, and on having enough resources. A self-preservation subtype is going to place a lot of emphasis on, security and what that means to their particular type. Then we have the one-to-one or sexual subtype, and for them, their primary concerns are going to be the intensity of the experience, the relationship that you guys are forming, focusing their attention on, the quality of that relationship, and can you come together in that state. Their behavior is going to be focused more on connection, keeping that relationship strong, and they're going to place an emphasis on the sense of well-being and what well-being means to them based on their primary type. The third subtype is social, and for this, the primary concerns are going to be belonging, recognition, and relationship to the group or structure. Behavior of a social subtype is going to be more about getting along with the herd or the mentality. So, in conflict resolution, this might look like just trying to get along and figure out how to stay connected. And they're going to place an emphasis on, how much power or standing they have in a relationship in the way that power is defined by their main type. Let's get into the way each specific Enneagram type handles conflict resolution and receiving feedback. The Enneagram is divided up into 3 triads: the anger triad, which are 8, 9, and 1, the shame triad, which is 2, 3, and 4, and the fear triad, which is 5, 6, and 7. So what this means is that in each triad, there is an internal expression of that key emotion, a conflicted expression of that key emotion, and an external expression of it. And so, you see in the anger triad, you have 8 is the external expression of anger, 9 is the conflicted expression of anger, and 1 is the internal expression of anger. Now, in a conflict, 8s, being external, are likely to, be very loud and vibrant and, want to drive their point home, and that creates an intensity that scares a lot of people. But when you're, in conflict with an 8, it's important to just give them respect and don't come at them full force. What they want is you to know that their vulnerability and them being their true self with you is earned. And if you're coming at them and not creating a safe space for them, they're not going to let you in on that vulnerable space. So with 8s, it's really important to remember to give them that autonomy. Now 9s are the adaptive peacemaker. They want everyone to get along, but they're the conflicted expression of anger. And what this means is that, they're not angry until they are. They'll appease, they'll, allow everyone else to feel okay about themselves until they suppress their own needs enough that they blow up. And they say if 8 is an unstoppable force, then 9 is an immovable object. And so with 9s, it's important in a feedback session or in a conflict resolution scenario of any kind is to ask them to voice what it is they need, because if they're not voicing it and you're not meeting their need, they just want to get along with everyone. And so usually that tends to express itself for them in not being able to even name their needs. So with a 9 in conflict, it's creating a space that's non-threatening, that just says, hey, I care about what you need. Now a 1 is the internal expression of anger, and this kind of creates a perfectionism. It comes into play when we use language about right or wrong, or are too critical, or create an environment where a 1 feels like they need to buckle down and get upset at themselves. They won't be open to resolving a conflict. And so for 1s, it's really important, they are the strict perfectionist, to just be authentic with them, to be upfront, to be honest, and to let them know that you have grace for them in that too, and in whatever conflict that you're trying to solve. Now with the shame triad, that's 2, 3, and 4, 2 is your external expression of shame. This is the considerate helper, and what this looks like is, I might feel shame, so I'm going to go out of my way to help everyone else and try to do everything I can to, not feel that shame. In a conflict setting, this can be expressed in the 2 turning around the feedback on you, because they're used to giving feedback and helping and being there for others, but sometimes when that spotlight gets turned on them, it's really hard to sit there and take that. So it's important to create a safe space for them where they know that they're not in trouble, they're not doing something wrong, and that you actually can connect more together when you solve that conflict. For a type 3, it's important to let them feel powerful in a feedback session. Let them feel like they have a equal footing with you when resolving conflict, and don't make them feel less than or try to downplay the things that they are sharing with you. It's really hard for a type 3 to be honest and forward about their emotions, and so when they do share those emotions, honor that space and make sure you affirm that they are sharing those. Now with the type 4s are the intense creatives. They feel everything really deeply. That's why the aesthetic around them matters so much. Their environment matters, where you give the feedback matters, but most importantly, the thing that matters the most to a type 4 is that you honor their feelings and the way that they perceive and view a situation. So with conflict resolution, they're not going to be able to get to resolving it until feelings are talked about. Use statements like I, me, my, tell personal stories, and emphasize that, this conflict is going to make either a task or whatever you guys are trying to figure out together more meaningful in the end when you resolve it. Make sure with a type 4 as well to frame the situation in a way where they have a choice to choose, in feedback or in what happens inside of a conflict, what path works best for them in the end. Now the last triad we have in the Enneagram is types 5, 6, and 7 in the fear triad. Now type 5 is the internal expression of fear. Type 6, conflicted expression of fear, and type 7 is the external expression of fear. So what this looks like: type 5, the quiet specialist. They feel afraid, and so sometimes they have to say, the world is really scary and there's a lot happening that's hard. I'm going to take some space away, reflect, and really, with that internal expression of fear, it's going inward into a safe space. So in conflict resolution, this comes out by them needing more time to process, needing to have, conversations that focus on specific, clear thoughts, and don't ask them to talk about their feelings if they're not ready to. Wait till they bring it up, and frame it in a way that says that their thoughts matter and that they have the time to process what it is that you need to resolve with them. Now for type 6. 6 is, the loyal skeptic. 6s are the conflicted expression of fear, and this is where they get that stereotype about anxiety, which not only 6s, or they're not the only ones who experience anxiety. Every type does, but because it's expressed in such a specific way for a type 6, they feel fear inwardly, they feel fear outwardly, and they're just trying to figure that out. So this leads to what we call analysis paralysis, which means that almost like decision fatigue. They can't make very many decisions because they just feel stuck. And especially in a conflict scenario, they're the loyal skeptic, they want to feel connected. They're going to need you to contextualize the magnitude of the problem up front. If you go into it and say, hey, we need to talk, their mind is going crazy. And so the number one thing you can do for a type 6 is to just tell them if it's a big deal or not before that, conflict resolution starts, before that giving them any feedback on their behavior. Creating a space where they feel safe, where they know that your relationship is not in jeopardy, whether that be a work relationship or a personal relationship, to know that that's safe despite the conflict that you're having. So those are the keys for type 6. And then you have a type 7, 7s being the external expression of fear. 7s are typically stereotyped as fun-loving, life of the party, but what that actually is an expression of when it's not authentic is that their fears are too much for them to handle, so they're going to go seek distraction elsewhere. And so a lot of times when a conflict comes up for 7s, they don't want to deal with the deep emotions that that conflict might bring up. They might try to joke or take your attention away. And so what's really important for a 7 is to keep things light and moving forward. That's what matters to them, is keep it positive. Make sure it's framed in a way that says we're moving forward together. This could look like, positive statements that say, hey, I know we're going to figure this out. Let's work together to do so. But ultimately with the attitude that your relationship can still be fun and happy even if there are hard moments, or even if pain has to be felt in the midst of that. Obviously, this is just a brief description of something that's really complex and involved for each individual type. Every human being is unique and brings their own blend of nature and nurture to the conflict resolution equation. If this is something that you're interested in exploring within yourself, follow along on social media where I post tips and tricks on conflict resolution along with plenty of other Enneagram content. I appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so excited to see how the Enneagram continues to impact your life.